All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breathing Life into Your Historic Site, developing school programs and tours for your heritage group or institution. This is the fifth webinar in a series of professional development and general interest sessions we developed as part of our Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project. Today's webinar will feature two speakers, Christine Castle and Katherine Belrose. I'll give a short introduction to the OHS, a bit of technical information, and then we'll get started. All right, so the Ontario Historical Society, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is a non-profit corporation and registered charity, a non-government group founded in 1888, bringing together people of all ages, all walks of life, and all cultural backgrounds interested in preserving some aspect of Ontario's history. The webinar you're about to undertake has been developed as part of the Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project. The project includes the redevelopment of the OHS website, which we'll be launching in the next few weeks, and a members-only blog called The Well, which is an interactive mapping tool showing heritage organizations and sites from our OHS Heritage Directory, and of course, this webinar series. The Strengthening Ontario's Heritage Network project was funded by the Government of Ontario's Museums and Technology Fund. So you're welcome to submit questions throughout the webinar. If a particularly important or repeated question comes up, I'll jump in and ask our speakers, but for the most part, I'll save them for the end of the webinar when we'll have a short Q&A session. Just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to OHS members and eventually to the public for viewing. We'll also be sending out a copy of today's slides to everyone, so you don't need to frantically write down everything you hear. You'll receive the slides and a PDF of educational programming resources tomorrow, along with a follow-up evaluation survey. And we really do depend on the comments and feedback we receive in those surveys, so please take the time, the few minutes to fill it out. Now, just a little bit of technical information before we get started. In order to ask a question, you just type a question in the space provided in your right-hand menu bar below Question. If you can't see the question space, you may need to expand the question section by clicking on it. You'll see a space with Type a Question for Staff, and that's where you write. You can also feel free to contribute in our chat window as well. You'll see me chatting to the whole group throughout the webinar. Now, if you run into trouble during the webinar and you need my help, you can also use the raised hand button. It's a small yellow hand also on your menu. If you click it, a little yellow hand will be raised next to your name, and I can see that, and I'll chat with you privately to ask what I can do to help. If you find that the slides are moving slowly or not at all, or your audio cuts out, try closing other running programs or tabs. The more bandwidth you're using, the harder the webinar program has to work. If you lose your connection, just try closing the webinar window and then re-entering the room with the link you received in your confirmation email. Closing and restarting the program will often solve the problem. Today's webinar will feature two speakers, and so let's take a quick look at each of today's contributors. Now, Christine Castle is a consultant, educator, and peer reviewer for museums, galleries, historic sites, government agencies, and professional associations in Canada, the United States, and the UK. She is also the owner and editor of the monthly e-newsletter, Museum Education Monitor. Castle has published and spoken widely on museum education and the professional development of museum educators, and has taught courses for the University of Toronto, the University of Victoria, Brock University, and several professional associations. She started her career first as a curator for the Oakville Museum and then the curator of the Gibson House Museum in Toronto. Coming to the field with a BA in Modern History from the University of Toronto, she holds an MA in Teaching Museum Education from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and a PhD in Education from the University of Toronto. Christine, are you there? Can you say hello?
Hello, everyone.
All right, our next presenter is Katherine Belrose. Katherine's passionate about recreating forgotten voices of the past and is a veteran museum educator with years of experience working with audiences of all ages. In 2014, Katherine helped to develop and establish school programs at the recently restored Palermo one-room schoolhouse with the Trafalgar Township Historical Society and fulfills the role of the Edwardian teacher on site. She also works as an interpreter at the Ontario Heritage Trust's Enoch Turner Schoolhouse and the Whitchurch Stouffville Museum, and has led educational programs at Black Creek Pioneer Village and Sharon Temple National Historic Site. She holds a BA General Arts from the University of Ottawa. Katherine, are you there?
I'm there. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time from your busy schedules to be with us this morning.
Now, before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick poll with everyone. So this is a bit of an interactive moment where we can tell us what learning level is the focus of your group or institution's educational programming. So I'll just launch that. You should be able to click the level you focus on as an educator, and it could be all of them, it could be one particular group. So as we can all see, most of us are thinking about all the education levels, which is fairly predictable, but a lot of people, elementary, JK to 6, intermediate, secondary, and adult, so kind of across the board here, but we're all thinking of different perspectives and ways of entering museum education here today. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to switch control of the screen over to Christine Castle, so just a moment while we change views.
Thank you for your patience all, and thank you, Allison, for the very nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me to present on a subject that's so close to my heart. I know there's many in the group joining us today who have worked with me in other situations in the past, so welcome to them, and welcome to those who I haven't yet met. I look forward to getting to know you better today. Thank you for joining Allison, Catherine, and I here today. We'll be talking for a bit, but then I hope, as Allison said, to hear more from you. Your earlier input has been really useful, and I hope this will meet your needs. And I hope you'll be open to some ideas that maybe you hadn't anticipated. So as Allison said, once upon a time I too was the curator of a small community museum. It was then called the Old Post Office and Thomas House Museum in Oakville in Ontario here. And yes, that is me in costume, a rather unusual costume, but nevertheless that's me 40 years ago. I was responsible for this historic house and a small exhibit area that was beside it. I dutifully planned and developed programs for the schools in my area because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. I gauged my success by the numbers, the number of classes that visit, the number of school kits borrowed, the number of phone calls I got from teachers, you know what I mean. Over 3,000 school children visited this seasonal site each year. So as you can understand, I was over the moon. But now, almost 40 years later, when I'm helping people like you at museums and historic sites and galleries around Ontario plan and develop their school programming, I wonder about my own. Did those school programs make any difference to anyone? I know they made a difference for me because I learned such a lot, mostly by trial and error, but I learned. I know they brought in lots of school groups and they brought up visitor numbers. But did they make any difference at all for the museum, the community, the teachers, the students? Did these school programs meet their needs? So today I want to look at how you might use school programs to serve needs and make a difference. We're going to look first at something called outcomes-based planning and evaluation, and those of you who've been on other webinars with me will know that this is, or in school museum studies with me, will know that this is something that I'm following avidly. I want us to look together at how you can consider where you're at now, get to know your audience, and build a program that serves needs, yours and especially theirs. So I hope that's your agenda too. I'll be using overall something called Shaping Outcomes Logic Model. It was developed by the Institute for Museum and Library Services in the United States over 10 years ago now. The URL for accessing that is available below, so you'll have these slides, but also I believe Allison will be preparing some resources for you later. This is a simplified version of the logic model, and I'll be addressing each of these segments in more detail as we go along. Outcomes-based planning and evaluation is what's called a logic model, and the word logic is used because there is a logical link between the system components that I just showed you, because this, then that. It's very useful to think of your program as a logic system. It has inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. And I know those may not be useful terms to you right now. They're not familiar terms, perhaps. But as we go along, I think you'll start to see what they mean and how you might be able to use them. There are, of course, many different logic models and approaches. I'm using just one today. As I said, if you're interested in more information, I encourage you to go to the Shaping Outcomes site for a complete online course with many helpful templates and useful case studies. So why bother to do it? Why use a logic model? Why not just jump right in? It's only one approach, as I said, but it helps to show not only what our programs are doing, which is what we often are very good at documenting, but also what they are changing. Why is it important to plan and measure success? Why is it important to change? For one thing, many funders insist on it. Public funders like the ministry through the Community Museums Operating Grant do insist on some kind of clearly defined and measurable system for undertaking a process of program evaluation. So in many ways you don't have a choice. It's not just public institutions like CMOG, but also private foundations with which you may have worked. We know that this kind of outcomes-based makes a difference in the development of communities. Only recently I discovered that the region of Durham, where I'm situated here in Whitby, Ontario, is using outcomes-based planning and evaluation to understand better the diversity in the region. So we know that that's being used to show that it's helping us make a difference. And finally, in the development of the museum education field more broadly, provincially, federally, and internationally, we know if we use consistent and concerted efforts, we can share and develop our programs more effectively. It almost goes without saying, but I like to emphasize that this is part of an essential shift in museums. It's been taking place over the past 25 years. The museums are not only, I should emphasize, not only about stuff like your collections, your objects, your buildings, your landscape, but for somebody. So we need to be able to show how we are helping people in our communities. Michael Spock and later Stephen Wheel emphasized this in their work. And Nina Simon today is carrying that on in her work like the Participatory Museum. I just love this, Museums Change Lives, a recent report from the UK. But before doing anything, and it's always hard for museum educators to stop themselves from diving right in and getting their hands dirty. And I know in terms of what you asked for from the session today, and I hope that Catherine's going to be able to provide some of those more direct examples of programs that are working. But before you actually get into that, it's best to step back and assess your current situation. You need to know where you are and what you're doing before you can embark on new plans and new situations, before you can borrow from others. Your museum's mission is critical. You need to know your museum mission statement. Many people say that you should document it, put it in a big sign up above your work desk. All of your programs should fulfill your museum's mission, not going off into other areas. So a good example is the mission of the Wing Luke Asian Museum in San Francisco. It tells us what they do, preserve and present the history, art, and culture of Asian Pacific Americans and to promote understanding. And they're doing it not only for Asian Pacific Americans, so for whom are they doing it, but between Asians, Asian Pacific, and Americans of other backgrounds. So for what you're doing, for whom, and not last but not least, why. In this case, it's to fill a gap, to empower communities, and provide a basis for shared understanding. Important goals. Keep in mind that a mission statement must be at the top of your priority list. Your education and interpretation policy is very important too. You could spend, as many have done, a whole seminar or webinar on developing that. I've put together a list of resources. The London Museums one there, 4 down, has some very useful practical advice. The others all have very interesting material. There's no set formula for an education and interpretation policy, but it does provide overall direction at the macro or overall level of what we'll be talking about today. So many of the elements we're talking about today would also be useful in this kind of program. You need to do an honest self-assessment before you start planning and developing new programs. So what are you doing now for and with schools? And when I go in to do a consultation, this is what I'm looking for, is some kind of documentation. So I need to see lists of your programs. I want to know how many of them are actually using your resources, what levels, and maybe some idea of feedback. Then look critically and honestly at what your best skills are. What does your staff do best? What do you do best? Don't be namby-pamby, can't be everything, can't be best at everything. There are some things you will know from your own resources and from talking to people what you're most well known for. What are your strongest resources? What is your collection remarkable for? What are your buildings? What is it that you do best? What story do you tell best? You need to know this. And again, honest, critical self-assessment. Then you want to look around in your community. Your school community is what we're talking about today. So what's happening in your school, in your broader community, in the area that's around you? How will you define that community? Is it geographic? Are you talking about a city, a region? Or are you talking about a community of interest? That needs to be determined, and it should be already in your statement of purpose, but you might want to list that. Then look in a little more defined area. What's happening in the schools in your area? What's happening in the schools in Ontario? A group like People for Education, which is an advocacy group, will often be able to tell you where the gaps are, where concerns are in schools generally. What's happening with the curriculum? You need to read and research the school curriculum in the areas of most interest to you. You probably want to start with the history or social studies curricula, given the nature of this particular webinar. And depending on the grade, you may be talking about social studies or you may be talking about history. As many of you know, there is a new history curriculum that many museums and galleries are looking at carefully now. It does emphasize the process, how you go about historical thinking over the content, the history and facts of the area. So again, you need to read and research that curriculum, and I provided a link that will help you look at that. Remember that you may also want to look at other areas where you could develop programs. For example, the science curriculum, particularly at the elementary level, allowed some small and medium-sized museums, community museums, to develop programs about small machines. So they were able to provide help in an area that was useful to the school teachers. Look at who are the key players. Consultants, principals, and here I'm talking about school consultants, principals, school teachers, parent councils, school trustees. They can all be helpful to you. They can all provide information, and they all have needs. So you have a better idea of what is the area where you can fill a gap, what are the gaps that exist, or what are the opportunities for your museum. Where might the things you do best address an identified need? And finally, potential partners. Who might support you in your endeavors, and who might you support? You might be talking about revenue granting foundations and government agencies, but you also might be talking about other museums and galleries. And I know Katherine's going to talk a little bit about this too. You might be looking at places where you share a mission and mandate and could work together. Commercial supporters like bus companies, catering firms, costume groups, all of these, again, might be of interest to you, and you do need to know it. It's a situation assessment. Some very good links, particularly the OHS Historical Educators webinar that was given this past fall and is available on YouTube for those of you who didn't have a chance to see it. Once you do all of this research, basically. So you looked inward, you looked at yourself, what you're best able to do, you looked outward, you saw where your opportunities lie. Then you're talking about who might be the target audience. You do need to focus. It's no good saying that you're going to be all things to all people. You need to focus and decide on a target audience or audiences. So who will be the target audience for your school program? And then start looking at what those people are like, what are their characteristics, their needs, what is important to remember, and what might create a barrier. You might do this research on your target audience by talking to people. So you might, for instance, school teachers, you might talk to those who do use your programs currently. You might try to broaden your efforts a little bit more and have a focus group. You might develop an advisory committee of teachers who are particularly interested and would be willing to come in and help you develop a new program. You might read books and articles, and there are plenty of them, not so many on Canadian examples, but many on American and UK. Although stereotyping and profiling are bad words in our society, when you are planning, it is helpful to form an impression of the typical person in your target audience. As humans, it's easier for us to think about how we might serve one person than it is to think about serving a generic mob. Depending on what your research tells you, you may have several profiles of teachers, in this case, at different levels. So I've formed a profile of Nora. She's probably 40-something. I'm looking at her on the elementary level. She's female, 10-plus years of teaching. This is what the research on teachers have told me is the kind of generic teacher. And so it helps me to think about Nora when I'm thinking about what might a program be. What might Nora need? I know that some of this, not because I've talked to many teachers recently, but because I've been able to access that excellent article listed below, Understanding Teachers' Perspectives on Field Trips, which actually was in 3 countries. And it found that teachers in 3 countries generally valued pre-visit help and sample lesson plans, an appropriate curriculum fit, and they wanted to be part of the development of that. They wanted to tell you what it was that they needed to know and help you develop it so that it suited their needs in teaching in the classroom. They wanted, as you pointed out even in your preliminary needs assessment, they want engaging hands-on activities. And again, Catherine's going to talk a bit more about that. They also wanted you to recognize, in this case Nora, wants you to recognize her logistical challenges, not to blame them for these things, but rather to seek ways to help them overcome them. Cost is a big issue for teachers in 3 countries. So the cost of the bus, the cost of your museum entrance or your historic house fee, the cost of lunches, supplies. These are important to teachers. It's no good to blame them for it, as I said, but rather to seek ways that you might be able to help them overcome those needs. Also, they wanted you to recognize time constraints. High school teachers in particular have great difficulties getting out of the classroom for any length of time. So if you want to do programs with high school teachers, you have to figure ways either to help them get out of the classroom or to make it so they don't need to come to your site. At the same time, don't forget about other stakeholders. What do they want or need from your school program, and how will they use the information? For example, program funders want to know if you are serving your target audience. They want to know how you define success and how you're going to know when you get there. What will they do with their information? They'll decide whether or not they fund you, and maybe even whether they use you as a good or bad example in their community. Let's look at the outcome-based planning and evaluation components using a case study. And again, this is one from the IMLS site, so it is American, but I think it's useful because of the level of detail that they go into. I found it an interesting one because it was looking at difficult history, reading bias, writing tolerance, using history's powerful stories. The Missouri Historical Society Museum developed it in conjunction with their partner, the Anti-Defamation League. And again, it shows you how similar missions can come together to develop an effective school program. Their target audience was middle and high school teachers in St. Louis schools. So again, it wasn't elementary. This didn't suit the elementary school curriculum. They were focusing on the curriculum that did address tolerance and bias, and so on those teachers in particular. And I want to point out that the target audience is school teachers, although students are often included, because school teachers are those who make the decisions about whether or not they will come and make use of the program. It's really their needs that you are addressing at this point. Once your situation assessment's in place and you've identified your target audience and their need, your strengths and goals, then you can start program planning. It tends to be a process of filling in the boxes. There's a very good worksheet available at the IMLS site, Shaping Outcomes, and it's very useful to use that if you want to go through this. However, you can use this webinar to do the same thing. We start with outcomes, and outcomes are the changes that occur to people, organizations, and communities as a result of your program. So in this case, it would be school teachers or school students. It's the benefit your audience receives from participating in your program. So as I did at the beginning, 3,000 students is not an outcome. It's not a change that occurs to the audience. It's, we're looking at the benefit the audience receives. And those are often categorized as changes in skills, attitudes, or knowledge. And you'll see that this is very much linked to the way a school curriculum would be set up, with outcomes being very important. So it starts to show you how your program can fulfill the outcomes of the school curriculum by borrowing from the school curriculum and putting it in place here. So for instance, a skill might be that students can use pencil and paper to draw images of your historic site. Attitude might be students no longer think the gallery is boring. Knowledge might be students can identify 3 examples of local architecture. In most museum programs and special events, we're talking about short to medium term outcomes, not the longer term like behavior, you know, how many times an adult visits the museum. Status would be whether students graduate from grade 12 because they took part in your programs, and condition might be that the residents of your community have a greater sense of well-being after participating in programs. So those are important, the longer term, but are not so often talked about. Outcomes all have to do with the target audience, changes in knowledge, attitudes, and skills. They don't, however, have to all be about the school curriculum. You'll see here that some, like demonstrating an understanding of bias and racism, are clearly linked to the school curriculum. However, others, like demonstrating how historical objects might help us learn, relate not only to the school curriculum, but also to many museum missions, people understanding how to use objects. And finally, your last outcome can have to do with simply the museum's mission, that you want people to know how to use the museum's resources. Impact is something that you may want to keep in mind. It describes your vision of a preferred future and underlines why the program is important. But it refers to very long-term change that you hope your project will help create or to which it might contribute. It's not easily measurable. In fact, very few studies have done much to do with this in individual museums or galleries, but it's very useful to have in mind when planning. So in this case, we're looking at students, you're hoping in the long term they might participate in community activities that promote tolerance in a big way. You're not likely to see this in action, but it's still useful to have the long-term view. So how do we achieve those outcomes? It's really just an equation. Think of your program as the solution to a need. So it's a project or a program that will bring about the desired outcome. Katherine will be talking about these individual solutions in more detail in just a minute. So there are many different possible solutions, not just a tour or a program per se. You can do things online, off-site, variety. It's really only limited by your creativity and your imagination. You should have a program purpose statement. Your program will do what, for whom, for what benefit or outcome, and this is really just a summary of what we've just done. And it should reflect your mission statement and your education and interpretation policy. It's really just the smallest, the micro version of those. Activities and services, these are the tasks or process that the program undertakes with or to the audience in order to meet their needs. So it's the steps taken to produce the outcomes. The focus is still, though, pretty much on the organization or the program itself, and not on the needs at this point. So we're talking about activities that you need to do. This is part of the planning. The ones on your left are the process and generally take place behind the scenes. So it's simply a list. Okay, I've got an idea for this program. What do I need to do in order to achieve it in as much detail as you consider useful. On the right are the services or products that will come about as a result of your doing this program. So you'll see that many of them have to do with products that don't relate to the museum, well, that relate, but are kind of more set apart from the museum school tour and the mini workshop. This is kind of like an iceberg. The museum school tour is only one part. There's so much else going on behind the scenes. Outputs are produced by your activities. These are the 3,000 school children that I talked about at the beginning. They're usually measured in numbers. They're important. They create the potential for outcomes to occur. Many program evaluations stop here, and that's not useful. We don't know if those outcomes are achieved. It's still important to document them, however. You won't know exact numbers at the beginning, but you will have an idea that you want to know the people who participated in the planning and development, the number of classes, the materials developed. You need to know the numbers. Inputs are a little more basic. These are the materials and resources that the program uses in its activities. So they're the resources needed for the project, for the program. They're pretty easy to identify and they're common to many organizations, but it's still useful in your planning and budgeting to know what you're talking about. So to list the equipment you think you're going to use, the staff, what facilities, what buildings you're going to use, how big a space you'll need, the standards, will you need to understand that better? Are those things that you need to incorporate? What other research do you need to do, curriculum or otherwise, in order to accomplish your project? So back to my story, how could I have known that I made a difference? First of all, I needed to know what I was trying to achieve, what was the outcome I was hoping for. What would I see, read, hear about the audience that would indicate success? Outcomes all have to do with target audiences, the changes in knowledge, attitudes, and skills. So how will I measure the success of these outcomes? Or how might I need to see, hear, or read something that will tell you? Don't spend a great deal of time trying to find these indicators. To start, you want to choose a program or a tour that is small and well-defined. So don't try to do this with all your programs at once. Start with something small. Bring as many people as possible into the process so that you've got an idea what not just you, but others consider important and that they would see as a result. So gather different perspectives. Limit the number of indicators to those you consider to be key. I would think 3 to 4, maybe 5, but no more than that. Otherwise, it's not going to be useful. Think of your first year of applying this process as a pilot. Identify the problems, improvements as you go, and document this. Think of this as a longer term, maybe a 3-year project. Apply your learning to program evaluations and live and learn. An indicator example, for those of you thinking, I don't know how you demonstrate understanding, it's like any kind of program or seminar planning. Think about what the outcomes are. So I want you to be able, or students in this case, to be able to identify at least 3 examples. And again, 3 is something you would have gotten by talking to other people from past examples. And you would have an idea that, yes, students should be able to do that reasonably. Again, these are rarely 100% successful. You're not going to have 100% of the students in the group being able to do this. So what is it reasonable to aim at? The number and percentage of participants will be the thing you're looking for. You look again at your past performance in other programs, how students been able to perform, and you're hoping, for instance, that they be able to identify the architecture. What do people in other institutions find? You again, talking to people in your regional groups, getting an idea of what other people have had some success with. Again, published literature or relevant programs, case studies that you've been able to find are always useful. So you may come up with 50 or 25% of the participants will. How will you be able to know? In this case, qualitative or quantitative, there are different kinds of data. Consider the kind of information that was seen as most credible by those who receive the evaluation. So your board, are we talking about museums advisors? What will make the most sense to them about whether this program was successful or not? There are many methods of data collection. You could spend a whole webinar on each of them. The best are those most likely to secure information, the most appropriate given the participants, so with teachers for instance, the least disruptive, and those you can do, afford, and handle well. So select the method that suits your purposes. Don't let the method determine the approach. Here's an example of that case study evaluation. So we're talking about the number and percentage of the students. It's only applied to those who participate in the program. You could ask students before the program and after the program. So you've got maybe your docent or your interpreter talking to the students before and after the program, and he or she would be the one who determined that, or you could do a slate, you could do a short sheet, a question and answer, something that seemed to be for fun, but in fact gives you some idea. So what are the top 3 evidence, whatever. And you see here 25 or 95% of each school too. And again, the same kind of thing, demonstrate knowledge. In this case, we're hoping that teachers will actually deliver 3 artifact-based lessons. We would know that maybe by calling them up or by having them self-report through some sort of methodology after the program. And again, not looking for all teachers. Finally, we'll know how to use the resource. Here we're identifying an online research center. We're hoping that teachers and students who participate in the program will simply log in, and we're hoping that will be good enough to show us that they're using it. You could go further than that, but at least the login would show us. So you'll need to have some idea of how you're going to know which students from which program. And then finally, when you've done all this, you've got everything all in place, and you've done your evaluation, you want to be able to modify your programs, use what you learned to go back and change the programs, as I suggest, look at it as a pilot, and then report to your stakeholders, your school community members, your staff and volunteers, and your funders, public and private. I hope that you'll share it too with the museum community. The Group for Education Museums in the United Kingdom has a great publication called Case Studies, and in fact they use an approach very much like what I've described today to describe some excellent programs, and they do include international examples. So there have been several Canadian examples, not just those from the United Kingdom. This is a never-ending story. We start and continue and change as we go along. I hope if you like to contribute and talk about this with others, you could continue. There is a Facebook group that was started last year in 2013, and participants include people from other webinars, students, and myself. So we're happy to discuss there. If you'd like to try the process and run into some issues, it's a great place to follow up. So thank you for listening to my story. I hope it's useful to you. Please get in touch as above if I can be of help in any way. So over to you, Catherine.
Catherine, are you there?
I am.
Welcome. I just wanted to do a quick mention. Christine mentioned the new history curriculum that the Ontario Government of Ontario rolled out in 2013. We actually did a webinar last September with the Historical Thinking Project. Jill Collier, who was their national coordinator, led a webinar called Historical Educators for a number of classroom teachers. It was all about the new history curriculum and how to teach it and work with it and build lessons out of it. So we do have that webinar available for members. It will be on our new website once we launch, and it will be eventually rolled out for public viewing, so please get in touch with me if you're interested in hearing more about that session. So Catherine, I'll just pass control to you, and why don't you take us away?
So thank you, Chris. I have to say listening to you and to Nora was enlightening, and I've become much more aware of how I need to serve needs and measure impact as a museum educator. So I'm going to start us on the premise that we are focusing on school bookings. We've done our planning and our marketing, and we've done all this work with the teacher in mind as outlined by Chris. And now the students are on their way. As an introductory exercise, I'm going to ask us to think of activities we find effective with students. Now my approach is to zero in on favorite pastimes of the period I'm working with, and for me it's almost always the mid-19th century. So I've chosen a few icebreakers or fillers, brain teasers, rebus puzzles, untangle games. Some of these are actual programs, the Sir Roger and Victorian paper crafts, and others store well in a Tupperware container and can be pulled out as required, fidgel, also known as Celtic chess, and tangrams, for example. And now we're going to ask you to share some of your thoughts. So we're going to move to the next screen, Allison. And so it's your turn. You may be working with different themes and a different period, so that's going to be interesting. Alphabetical order absolutely not required, and I'm going to ask you now, Allison, to jump in and tell us how we're sharing.
Thanks, Catherine. So if anyone wants to let us know what activities you use in your school programs, if you currently offer school programs, are there any go-tos you have that you'd like to bring out for students? I know when I worked as an interpreter, some of the same games you've mentioned, Catherine, you know, Roger de Coverley and Find the Slipper, Pass the Slipper, which is a favorite Victorian game. Someone has just piped in and said scavenger hunts, which are always a great fun, a good option. And definitely any kind of parlor game from the Victorian era I always felt went over pretty well with the programs I was teaching. But if anyone else, bingo games were mentioned. Let's see what else. We love sack races and old-fashioned relays, clothing photo booth for pioneer clothes, marbles, singing games. These are all suggestions coming down the line. Cube, an old Swedish game to play outside. Artifact match. Spelling bee, guess the artifact and its use. So lots of different options coming through from our participants today, Catherine.
That is fantastic. So now we have lots of activities in place for the students, which means we're going to be able to tailor our programs much more effectively. And here I want us to think about our role as museum educators. Now, even though we may serve different functions within our organizations and have different backgrounds, when we're working with students, we're all museum educators. And as educators, we focus our delivery, I think, in 4 key areas. So one of the first things we want to do with students on a program or a tour is start a discussion or a conversation. And we want to end our program by asking students if their initial impression changed and why, or we ask younger students to relate. We present information that is relevant and tied to our theme. We adjust our approach and vocabulary to suit the level of the student. So thirdly, we focus on asking open-ended questions. If we're not getting the response we need, we may want to share a quote or read a passage and ask students if they agree. And we're doing all of this with a strong theme-based approach. While we're busy connecting for students, we also want them to make connections. We want them to think like historians or history detectives if they're a younger group. So the next few slides we're going to show are site-related, and take a look at some of the experiences I've had and approaches I've learned along the way that I believe work really well with students. So living history is a great term for a site like Black Creek Pioneer Village. And I'd like to suggest we use the expression active history for the programs we deliver. So let's ask ourselves a few questions. Will costumed historical interpretation work for our program? Might we include more music, art, or storytelling? Might we look at a debate, a town hall meeting, or another form of reenactment? Or do we want to incorporate more technology and link our site to a classroom full of students off-site? All are valid approaches, but they need to feel right for the program. So here's a second exercise. Please take a moment to jot down an active history idea you might like to try. This one, however, is for you to hang on to for future use. And I'll give you a moment for that, and we'll move some of the slides forward. Great. And while we're on this slide, I'm going to take a moment to answer a question that came in from one of our registrants ahead of time asking about offering food programs. So while at BCTV, I baked a lot of the Samuel Stong House, and I agree kids love to cook, but it's becoming more and more difficult with all of the allergies. If cooking is a main part of the story you tell on your site, then ways should be found to continue offering it. Off the top of my head, I suggest demonstrating how several staple foods were made, and then having a couple of absolutely allergy-free projects for students to work on together. And this could be a Johnny cake, for example, made with cornmeal, gluten-free flour, lactose-free milk, and baked in a wood stove. So we're going to move on now to Sharon Temple National Historic Site. And some of us may feel that our sites have mainly adult stories to tell. And while that may be the case, we shouldn't forget that our buildings and their natural environment also appeal to younger audiences. So when the York Pioneer and Historical Society saved Sharon Temple in 1917, they certainly had this in mind, and they opened the site a year later as a Pioneer Park and Museum. While there, I couldn't help wanting to recreate the YPHS intent, and so we introduced an outdoor games area and developed a little more interpretation in the buildings by adding some self-directed activities, but no costumed interpreter. The next slide was taken in the temple during a special event, the Words Alive Literary Festival. And originally, I wasn't really sure how to best offer children's programming in the temple, but soon discovered that it didn't take much to create an intimate space for younger audiences. So the kids have done a little foursquare writing, and what better place to do this than in a foursquare space? And you can see the results hanging on the clothesline, and everyone is making birds of peace in the form of a traditional Victorian paper craft. So let's take a look quickly at my current sites of employment. The Whitchurch Stowell Museum, consisting of 2 schoolhouses, and we're moving forward here, a visitor center, log house, and the beautiful Brown House, the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse and Ontario Heritage Trust property, and the Palermo Schoolhouse operated by the Trafalgar Township Historical Society. When I was at Black Creek, I remember remarking with other guides that we could have spent our entire tour at the schoolhouse or the log house, and today, almost 10 years later, I'm still discovering new ways to teach students in a schoolhouse environment. We had a plumbing issue at Palermo one day, and I quickly established a dry sink. So today we continue to use the dry sink so students can wash their hands throughout the day without having to line up at a modern washroom. Okay, we're going to focus a little bit on planning, and then I will be ending with a number of slides that give you some ideas on resources. So when building a new program, I think we need to be looking at a full day offering with 2 90-minute components. Now, one of the components could be an already existing program, but 4 hours seems to be the workable time for schools having to book buses or take public transportation. So with 2 90-minute programs, this allows time for snack and lunch, and if a teacher prefers, they can book just the main program or maybe the new 90-minute program as a half-day outing. Now, this is where Chris mentioned that I would speak speak a little bit about partnerships. And what I'd like to suggest is we explore joint programs as we have at Enoch Turner Schoolhouse. While we can accommodate 2 classes at Enoch Turner, the first in the schoolhouse, the second in the Great Hall for dancing and decorum, for example, we also suggest that teachers consider a walking tour of historic Corktown or a program at a neighboring site, such as First Parliament or Toronto's First Post Office. Partnering can also include an educator from another organization who guests for the day. And a third possibility is to involve your public library, particularly for a local history component. So let's take a quick look at the schedules. We need to be flexible when it comes to scheduling. What I discovered in Oakville is the need to start programs much earlier, as early as 9 a.m. sometimes. It seems that Halton Region schools can't book a bus to return to school much beyond 1:30 p.m. So the schedule to the left reflects a typical day in Oakville at the Palermo Schoolhouse, 1 space, a little outdoor activity, and 1 educator, although lately I've been fortunate to work with a society member who recently retired from teaching. And the schedule to the right works beautifully for Enoch Turner Schoolhouse. If a History Squared program has been booked with the post office, students have a 15-minute walk between sites, so their lunch hour in the Great Hall at the schoolhouse is about 30 minutes, with about a 15-minute overlap of the 2 groups. And if there's time, groups will use the City of Toronto playground next to the schoolhouse. Reduce, reuse, recycle, and repair. I was introduced to the idea of a peace basket at Black Creek and would remind students that it's spelled P-I-E-C-E. And I'll just direct our attention to the middle photo, bottom row. It's a craft that I brought to the Palermo Schoolhouse. Initially, worried that spool knitting would just be too complicated a thing to do with grades 3 students. But taking into account the fact that so many of them are making rainbow loom bracelets, they know how to pick up a stitch and slip it over a peg. So it's been a really successful craft this season. With tighter and tighter budgets, it's important that museum educators use resources readily available on site. And many of us have spent time digitizing our collections, and so that means more photos and maps to share with students. And if we're going to spend money on program supplies, it's likely going to be for crafts or various hands-on items. Our next couple of slides suggest buying wholesale, retail, or doing some real shopping. If you need to buy in quantity and quickly, then I'd recommend Zibbers in Toronto for toys. That's Z-I-B-B-E-R''S. They don't have a website, but they allow pickup for small orders. 2 interesting retail choices include Mastermind Toys. They carry the Zibbers product and well-priced stilts, and Canadian Tire, especially for outdoor games. But the best sources for shopping include antique markets, suppliers such as Spencer's Mercantile in Hamilton, and a museum that might be able to transfer just the thing you need. Thanks to a transfer of 29 desks by the Halton Region Museum, we were able to start offering school programs at the Palermo Schoolhouse almost immediately following receipt of Trillium funding. And if you're looking for new ideas or the latest craft materials, check the Spectrum Educational Supplies and Royalco websites. Both are Ontario-based companies. At the same time, we want to be looking at other types of programming. So I'm just going to take a moment to consider a very successful program at the Whitchurch Stovall Museum. And now in its 2nd year, the Whitchurch Stovall Museum's Camp Van Dorf has become a booming business, and cooking camps are in fact the ones filling up the most quickly. This is an example of excelling in one area so that you can grow in others. My last few slides to conclude will remind us, I hope, of the great work we do each and every day in our museums and on our historic sites.
Well, thanks, Catherine, and we're just going to hopefully move through your photos here of the people who make, who make these programs come to life. So thank you so much for the narrating the slides as I clumsily move through them, and thank you to everyone for bearing with that.
Thank you for your help, Allison.
Oh, not at all. It looks like you've got some great people working with you at various sites, so happy to show those photos off. And I think it is important that we remember to take photos of the people teaching and working in our museums, because quite often we have photos of our visitors and we have photos of our collections, but we don't always have a photo of our interpretive staff or any of the volunteers or educators who show people around the site, and not just in costume. We want to have them handling things and talking to audiences. It's great for promotional materials, but it's also a valuable record of what you've been doing at your site, so very important.
Thank you very much for listening. We're on to the very last slide where I do say thank you.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. And so now we are just at 12 o'clock, and we have a few, well, if you don't mind, we'll go over for a few moments for a few questions. So I will bring Christine back into the fold, and we can all have a little chat about the questions that have been posed by our audience members. So we've had a few questions come through the line while we were going through our presentation, and I just wanted to pose them to both of you. The first question that I received came from Greta Bradley, and she asked, is there room for essential questions in museum programs? So if both of you feel comfortable talking to this, or one of you has more to say, then please go ahead, but that's our first question.
I can speak to that briefly. I think it's really important to deal with essential questions with difficult knowledge. I think it helps when it's in conjunction with the school curriculum. It's generally students that are a little older. I did some work at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights about programming that was being done around the world. Most sites have a kind of lower age limit, so that perhaps grade 4 and up could probably deal in some way, shape, or form with difficult knowledge. And I think essential questions, things like I was talking about bias and racism, certainly there are ways to deal with it. It doesn't always mean the same as you would deal with adults addressing difficult questions like that. It might be more ways to acknowledge that difficult things happen, maybe on a smaller scale, such as what you might deal with in the schoolyard or on the street, and how students would be able to develop their own tolerance and their approaches for coping.
And if I could contribute an experience I had working in Ottawa with a rather controversial exhibit called Wolves and Humans, and the dioramas were quite graphic. And I was asked to market this exhibit. I was working in the public relations office at the time to families. And I was quite concerned, but I was told that the educator, and this was the person who basically mentored me and had me continue on in the education field within the museum sector, she said, no, just leave it to me. We're going to provide space. We're going to provide a number of low-key activities so children can explore their feelings, and we're going to demystify the wolf, and it worked beautifully.
Great, thank you, ladies. And just as an aside, Greta's question refers also specifically to the new historical and social studies curriculum that was put out by the Ontario government in 2013, these types of questions. So I think you guys have done a good job kind of answering it from your perspective. We also have, as I mentioned, our Historical Educators webinar, which goes more in detail to those kinds, integrating that kind of learning and those kinds of questions into a teaching environment, and can be applied to museum environments. So again, I'll include information on that webinar in our resources sent out tomorrow. So the next question is a bit of a situation question. So it says, the Dundas Museum has a sword that was at Queenston Heights when Brock was killed. This is an experience that students can't get in their history classroom. My challenge is to make the visit to the museum unique. My unit on when the First Nations met the Europeans, however, is too much content, not enough hands-on. Perhaps it depends on the wealth of the artifacts a museum enjoys. Could you comment on this, please? So I guess maybe talking about, this person's asking about programming and teaching when your content seems to be more descriptive, or something you tell to people rather than something you interact with in general. So how would you tackle that kind of experience?
Well, I haven't had the opportunity to teach a lot in that area, although I have done 1837 rebellion programs. So I think what I would be looking for is a lot of journal, diary entries, art of the period, as many sort of concrete expressions of the story. And I probably would obviously encourage a lot of group work and have groups delve into one particular aspect and find a way that they could then all present or share their findings. When I'm doing a First Nations unit in a grade 3 classroom, I have a talking stick that I pass around. And it's just wonderful to see the glow on a student's face when they have control of the conversation holding that talking stick. In a program that I'm about to offer, once it's a bit more fully developed, students will read through a letter that was written to Mr. Gourlay in 1817, and they will paraphrase a number of those paragraphs, but describing their particular family situation after they've had a chance to break into groups and study 6 particular families in the Oakville area. So I hope that's a little helpful. Maybe you're already doing some of those things.
Great, Catherine, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next question we just received, and it's a very specific one, but it probably applies to a lot of institutions that are listening in today. Do you have any suggestions for engaging interests of families in a small town, approximately 5,300 people, where the foundation is agriculture and forestry? So I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly which institution this person comes from, but what would you guys suggest is the best way, in addition to what we've talked about here today, to target and reach out to a community of such a small size and with a very specific focus?
I think the first thing to do is to talk to families and find out what their concerns are, what their interests are, what sort of issues are they wanting to know more about, what are they dealing with. I think the whole point of what I was trying to say is that really what we're trying to do is not just attract people to the museum, but rather meet their needs. So you really do need to read the local paper, you need to talk to communities. I assume if you're living in a small community, you probably have a pretty good idea what families are concerned with and how might your museum help you address it. If what they're interested in is, maybe new immigration, they're concerned about, losing their jobs to foreign workers, particularly in agriculture, sometimes that's an issue, then maybe you develop a program that talks about the history of workers in your community and helping people to understand how people have worked in the past and how they might work together in the future.
And so I think I'm going to maybe suggest as well, Christine, that you can use an important event in a community or an anniversary to kind of launch a program. And my previous experience, the kind of thing I guess we used to say in the late 80s, is that sometimes you need to bring them in for the wrong reason so that they can keep coming back for the right reason. And so something just very low-key, celebratory, anniversary-based could relaunch your programming.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So our one final question, and this will be our last question, folks, so thank you for submitting. What are your recommendations for helping and encouraging high school teachers to book trips to the museum? Are the obstacles so great that we should be considering outreach or online conference learning instead? So I realize that our focus, a lot of focus with educational programming is much younger, but do either of you have any ideas or practices you've encountered to really make connecting with secondary level students and educators?
I know that our marketing, for the most part, is geared toward that younger group when it comes to an education program because we know that those teachers will book trips. And for an organization like the Black Creek Pioneer Village, that's 24,000 students a year. However, you need to establish, I think, as Black Creek has been doing, a partnership with the local high schools or York University. So they have been conducting many more tours now for various history professors at York. And it's amazing how if your museum or your historic house is set as it should be and you feel comfortable in there, you will be able to find and relate to no matter what age comes through, using the material culture that you have around you. But definitely walking tours are very attractive to an older group.
Thanks, Catherine. Those are really good suggestions. I had the experience when I was in Washington to do the George Washington program to intern in a high school in Maryland. What I discovered is that high school teachers face a variety of challenges bringing their students out of school, particularly those who are working in the shorter period classrooms rather than the longer periods where it might be 2 periods each morning and 2 periods each afternoon. It was a real eye-opener for me because I think I had simply thought high school students were or high school teachers were a little lazy or something, that they wouldn't bring their students. But it is very challenging for them. So my best advice would be, if you do want to develop programs for high school students, and I expect because you've already identified others like online resources and teacher workshops, that sort of thing, that you've already kind of experimented with this. But my best advice would be to work more closely with teachers who are already taking part in your program to develop some sort of an advisory group to help you develop programs that would suit the needs of high school teachers. And it may be that it isn't site-based, that it is online, that it's lesson plans, that it's maybe a visit, an outreach program. Those may not be the answers you want to hear. If you do want them to come to your site, then you may want to, again, talk to the advisory group or 3 or 4 of the teachers with whom you're close to look at the constraints they face and how you might help them to address that. I don't think you're ever going to have a huge base in high school students, but in my experience working at Oakville and Gibson House, those high school students and teachers that did come were extraordinarily interested and valuable, and in fact often then became the students themselves volunteers. They were just that much more committed. So it may be that you're just aiming at a lower number and maybe a greater quality of experience. But again, I think you need to talk to the high school students in your community to find out from them what would work best.
Great, thanks Christine. Excellent ideas there, and I just wanted to mention we had some great activity on Twitter during this webinar, especially thanks to Julia Fielding at the Clarington Museum for tweeting a picture of her mandate, her institution's mandate, situated above her keyboard. It's an excellent way to keep it always in front.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah. And make sure if you
other photos you would have, that would be amazing that we share some photos. I think photos that tell us so much.
Definitely, we're always looking for people to share photos of what they're doing at their institutions, and we're happy to include those on our blog with proper credits, of course. And we also like people to tweet photos to at Ontario History, which is our Twitter handle, and we'll retweet. So we can definitely share the love and spread your message and your programs and practices across the web. So thank you to both of our presenters today. We're going to wrap up now. And I just wanted to do a quick mention of this webinar series. It has some great programs coming up for the fall. We're actually going to do a few different webinars with dates to be announced with historical educators. So I mentioned the one we did last fall for elementary and intermediate level history education. This will be a follow-up to that at the secondary level. We're going to do a webinar on teaching the Underground Railroad and Black history education in Ontario, financial management for heritage groups and financial planning, and also accessibility and heritage with a well-known and great friend of the OHS, John Ray. So please get in touch with us, stay on our mailing list, become a member, and you'll find out more about these webinars. You'll get reduced prices for the webinars, and you'll have access to the recordings immediately as they're available. So if you're interested in becoming a member, please get in touch with Christina Perfetto. She's our membership coordinator, and her email is there, and will be on the resource PDF you receive tomorrow. So thank you once again to our speakers, Christine Castle and Katherine Belrose, and thanks to everyone for attending. Best of luck in building and renewing your school programs and tours. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.